Captain Sadler, can you briefly share how your experiences in the Navy and your career path led to you becoming an expert in naval statecraft?
For me, it's probably a couple of events. The most formative was as a young lieutenant. My first short tour was actually on the USS Blue Ridge flagship for 7th Fleet, where Admiral Walt Dorn pulled me on board to be his flag lieutenant. It's like a personal assistant. And that was 1999 to 2001. So this was the time when we had the coal attack. It was also the time where we had the infamous P3 incident. I was there for front lines for all of that with the numbered fleet and a few other things. But the naval statecraft piece was that the operational, but also the economic and the commercial shipping side. Because Admiral Dorn, we would always go visit the commercial shipyards. We would always go and engage with the ship owners societies wherever, because he impressed upon everyone that the Navy relied on and was foundational the commercial shipping sector and industrial sectors. And so that knowledge about how you have to pair the economics, the industrial with the operation, really kind of the genesis of what became naval statecraft. And then later experiences like being a defense attaché in Malaysia, working on the rebalance to the Asia Pacific, both with the White House but also the Pentagon and Indo-PACOM in Hawaii, those also added onto it. But that event, that 7th Fleet exposure, was really what opened my mind up to things beyond just keeping your eyes inside the boat, so to speak.
Thanks for that. How did your role in time and service shape your views on the U.S. Navy's role today?
There was a lot of events. I mean, we starts in the 90s with the downsizing at the end of the Cold War. And too often, senior leaders were not really sure what our mission was, and they should have had the foresight, because we certainly knew it, having been in all the briefings, that China was coming on fast, missing strategic changes because of bureaucratic inertia or political conveniences at the time. I mean, and that also kind of colored my worldview and my thoughts on things, and also where Navy's role is. And when I was on the CNO's personal staff, first time 2011 to 12, and then again 15 to I'd say 16 timeframe, it was clear that Navy needed to be proactively engaged in shaping not just the military and Department of Defense, but the national vision and direction going ahead if we were going to try and keep the peace well into the future.
Thank you for that. In your book, U.S. Naval Power in the 21st Century, a New Strategy for Facing the Chinese and Russian Threat, you outline a new approach to naval strategy. What inspired you to write the book, and what is the core message today for policy and military leaders alike?
So the first book, there's another one, but both of these is a sense of frustration that we have been operating in an outdated mindset, and the world was changing rapidly, and we were just not willing to see it or to act on that. So it was a frustration. And the changes were China operating between our cylinders of excellence. You had a military that was doing military things over here, separate and devoid from the diplomats doing diplomatic engagement, dialogues kind of here. And then you had your economics folks, commerce, and your USTR folks kind of doing their tradey and their industrial stuff over here. The Chinese were able to triangulate between all that, and the frustration was it was obvious, but yet we couldn't change or didn't want to change our structures to update for a modern, what now is a new Cold War. And we're probably past due for another National Security Act like that in 1947 that reorganized our government for the long haul in what was then the beginning of a Cold War with the Soviet Union.
How do you define naval statecraft, and why is it critical to distinguishing between traditional warfighting roles and the broader maritime responsibility of the U.S. Navy?
The first thing is the Navy is more than just a war fighter. And it was very refreshing a couple of years back. You had Congressman Mike Gallagher, who was able to get it changed to our Title 10, and that basically says that navies exist to support peacetime operations as well as wartime. It's not a surprise, but having that codified in law nails the point home that's also captured in our U.S. Constitution. The Navy has always been more than just a war fighter, and naval statecraft's not a strategy, it's a framework to try to bring us back to our core and our historical origins, that we are not only a war fighter, but we're also a shaper of the peace and a protector of our trade.
Can you explain the difference between naval statecraft focusing on fleet readiness and shipbuilding and maritime statecraft which encompasses economic, diplomatic, and logistical functions at sea?
Maritime statecraft is actually just a rephrasing of naval statecraft. And the former Secretary of the Navy had taken the ideas from the book, and he presented a speech, a major policy speech, to Harvard back in September 2023, and he called it Maritime Statecraft. Part of that is because the politics. Navy sounded too militaristic for the Biden administration, so they changed the name. But the ideas are very much the same. In fact, 100% the same, I can say with high confidence. So those two are the same, but I think the maritime statecraft is probably a better term also because it captures the naval statecraft is also embraces the commercial, the economic aspect. So in the book, talk a lot about developmental economics. This is where you focus in on trying to create opportunities to expand trade, growing small and medium industries, for example, or corporations, for example, they can trade. But those also become the foundations for building ports, building airstrips, which also serve military purpose. The type of operations that you do in the peacetime that we need still to adapt or to take on the Chinese in what really is best described as a maritime insurgency against the rules-based order. So we need to have a maritime counterinsurgency. Naval statecraft embraces that because the target, the center of gravity, isn't really necessarily the Chinese. It's the people that are adhering to that rules-based order at sea. There is a piece of this that gets into the operations, but it really is not about how we fight the fleet, though the book does go into great detail about how that is. Naval statecraft is more about the peacetime new Cold War competition.
Looking back at American naval history, what lessons do you believe are most relevant to addressing the current challenges posed by adversaries like China and Russia?
If we don't get our house in order and and the Chinese do decide to go kinetic in a fight in the next few years, we're very likely going to find ourselves in the same situation in the opening months of World War II, called the Phony War. That war should have been over in 6 weeks, but instead it was 6 years because defense industrial bases weren't building, they weren't able to be rapidly brought up to speed to then fuel the military to go take the fight to Berlin when it could have been done fairly straightforward while the Nazis were involved in Poland. We have the same situation, a too thin, too antiquated defense industrial base, naval shipbuilding in particular, and munitions aren't being produced at the scale. The war in Ukraine has made that very, very evident. So we run the risk of a phony war. So that's a good historical lesson. But another really good naval lesson is the Battle of Java Sea. And it really starts with the China fleet being moved a year before Pearl Harbor from China into the Philippines, and then the exodus out of the Philippines as the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army started the invasion of the Philippines and pushed us all the way out, chased us all the way into Australia. So the lesson there in the Java Sea is you have to operate your Navy and get familiar with the people, the ports, and the environment that you're very likely going to have to fight in. It's a lesson I think that we take for granted and have, in some cases, have forgotten.
In light of China's massive shipbuilding capabilities and Russia's strategic maneuvers, what do you see as the most pressing challenges to the U.S. naval power in the 21st century?
Now, the first is just building and sustaining the fleet that we have. As sad as it is to say, our industrial capacity is not in a growth trajectory. It hasn't been for many years. And that you see this in an inadequate workforce. You see it with a supply base that's not able to meet demand. You don't even have enough naval architects to really deal with the surge and the change of requirements, many of them expected as you build a new ship, like first in class, the Constellation frigate. So that's the number one challenge. We've seen the enemy and it's us. But for the Chinese and the Russians, the new nuclear weapon systems that they're fielding, both of them, this is challenging our strategic deterrence. And it's weakening that. And then that has a carry-on effect over in the conventional side because the Chinese in particular have a massive industrial capacity lead on us that we're not going to be able to catch up in the foreseeable future. That makes them very confident.
How does economic warfare, such as control over global supply chains and commercial shipping, play into the strategic calculus of naval statecraft?
The other part of this is that on the Chinese side, and this is a peacetime, the Chinese effectively control the terms of trade. They have a network of over 100 ports strategically located that they either own outright or have a controlling stake. And even if they don't, they can use their small presence nearby or associated with it to curry favor through outright graft and bribery. So the ports where ships have to call, do transshipments and fuels as well as cargo is one. They also control, they have the world's largest shipping fleet. They also have the world's largest shipbuilding. And so many of our allies go and send their ships there for repairs. Many of our allies, to include even the foe of the Chinese Communist Party, the folks in Taiwan, also buy their ships from mainland China. It's an unavoidable market that has significant strategic risk. And so again, the shipbuilding and the maritime trade part of naval statecraft, it is how to actually grow a alternative and also to bolster our own sea lift capacity such that we can sustain a wartime American economy. Right now, it's a very serious question of whether or not we could do that.
Captain Sadler, recent
Yeah.
events around the globe have shown the modern conflicts that can be protracted. What changes are needed in our naval logistics and shipbuilding strategies to sustain long-term engagements against near-peer adversaries?
It's snuck up on the Navy. It's been a problem admired for far too long. You have the military sea lift commands having to sideline like 17 ships because they don't have the merchant mariners. These are commercial sailors, civilian sailors from maritime administration. Navy hasn't really paid much attention. We don't have enough of them. Haven't been able to attract enough of them. Now we don't have the logistic ships the Navy would require to keep the fleet fueled, and that includes keeping the aircraft operating off an aircraft carrier. So when Bighorn ran aground and was offline, was supporting carrier strike group off of Yemen, again going against the Houthis. It actually had a deleterious effect and a suppressing effect on carrier flight operations until replacement could come up. So there's one there is we need to have more fueling like tankers, and this is made even more urgent with the shuttering of Red Hill Fuel Depot in Hawaii, which during World War II we were able to keep a very shoestring thin tanking fleet, about 6 of these tankers, to keep the fleet fueled in the early years, the early months of World War II. When you have that forward stage fuel in large supply, you don't need as many logistic ships. Well, we need to have more logistic ships. We need more places to store fuel because the problem is that big. Then when it comes to moving munitions and supplies, we need more of those dry cargo and ammo ships. We have some, but when we get in a fight, they're going to get targeted by the Chinese. They know that the logistics is our Achilles heel. They've written about it for about 15 years. They're going to go after those ships. And so we have to assume that we're going to lose a few of those. And we're not, by my estimation, prepared for that. It's not that we don't know. It's just we haven't been able to recapitalize and build that part of the fleet out. And we certainly haven't been able to man it. And the final thing, of course, is the shore side. We also need to have much more robust network of ports and airfields throughout the Pacific, ones that we control, not simply places that we come and visit, because that's not assured access, and we can't guarantee that we have all the supplies and materials there that we need. And I'd say most critically in this regard, it's the South and Central Pacific, which we've kind of neglected for many decades. The Chinese are doubling down and really focusing in on this area. And if we're not careful, they will have burrowed themselves so far into that region that it makes it very challenging for us to sustain combat operations or even operations in a crisis with the Chinese influence throughout that South and Central Pacific area.
With bipartisan initiatives like the Ships for American Act on the table, how do you see legislative action helping to revitalize U.S. shipbuilding and restore our maritime industrial base?
You have a Navy because you have a large shipping and in maritime industry, because you have to have a prosperous country will need to have a Navy, and that Navy then protects. It's a virtuous circle. But right now we have a Navy, but we don't have a commercial fleet. And we don't have the workforce, we don't have the shipyards, we don't have the ships to really sustain or build the Navy that we need. So the Ships Act for America kind of embraces this comprehensive problem set. And there's like 4 elements, four wheels of this cart, which I wish there was a better analogy, one more maritime, but 4 wheels on a cart, so be it. You've got the demand side. So this is the Jones Act. It's not the solution, but it does provide a government way to incentivize or to subsidize a portion of demand for ships, merchant mariners. Again, it's not the solution. It's in the front part of the car. where we're going to direction to. The other wheel in the front is the shipyards. And this is building and attracting capital investment, and making America a place for capital to come to, from preferably and preferentially from our treaty allies like the Japanese and South Koreans and others in NATO countries, to try to come here and grow and invest in a maritime industrial base. So that's the ports. That allows you to build more ships, allows you to build more Navy ships, allows you to maintain and repair more of those ships, and also more workers into the workforce and the labor force. So that's the front part of the cart, where the steering wheel is attached in the direction. But the motive force, the real engine of regaining our maritime muscle and strength, is connected to the engine and the rear drive here, and that is your human capital, your workforce in the shipyards, your welders, your pipe fitters, the folks there, your naval architects, which we don't produce enough. We have like one professor at the postgraduate level teaching in the United States on this, and we produce maybe a dozen American citizens in naval architecture. This is a strategic dilemma, but we got to fix that, and that's going to be one of the wheels to drive forward, is this human capital piece. The other wheel in a very critical element is innovation. And America has a lot of latent intellectual capacity and innovation know-how. It just has to be applied. Think like SpaceX, but for ships. We have the people, we have the culture to get in there and just mix things up, but we need to innovate. So things like maritime prosperity zones, again, to try to attract the capital, folks in the waterfront, technological maritime tech innovator hubs that are associated with the construction, the laboratory, and also the training all together to innovate and to develop a revolution in shipping that would be America's comparative advantage to seize some portion of the global maritime market space. That's not something the Jones Act will do by itself. That's something that we have to consciously try to nurture and to focus outward. Because until we actually have some minimum market presence in a global marketplace, a competitive one, we're never going to have a sustainable maritime industrial capacity. And we're never going to be able to sustain the Navy that we need to.
What role emerging technologies play in the future of naval statecraft? Are there innovations that could potentially reshape the Navy, maintain global dominance?
There's like a cocktail of these things. Many of them have dual use. They feed into a commercial use to get to that maritime statecraft, where it bridges also over into the military. So in the commercial, the Ships for America, think about small modular reactors on ultra-large container ships to allow you to do high-speed transits, sustain 25 knots or more. You don't need as many large container ships, but you can also put more cargo on there. You could do automated cargo handling on using blockchain for smart containers, where you could reconfigure them so you could offload in smaller containers, either vertical lift, think of dirigibles or even drones, or move them over to smaller feeder vessels so you have access to more ports without spending billions of dollars of capital investment to dredge, build up cranes and wharf space. So that's one. Distributed manufacturing. You can also greatly distribute and disaggregate the centers of production. And then, of course, you also have big data analytics, being able to analyze the demand, the supply, production sites, and logistic chains in a very fluid and dynamic way. All of that is at the speed of markets, but it's also at the speed of combat. And the military has much the same need when you look at Army and Marine Corps trying to operate in the north-south lateral in the first island chain. So Philippines archipelago, and of course the southwest Okinawan islands in Japan in littoral combat. And so being able to have a large resupply ship still out of real danger, still, inside weapons range, but in close enough, but not so close that it's very likely to be sunk by Chinese direct fires, that you can then offload and or rapidly move cargo off of that platform and into a disaggregated and widely dispersed Army and Marine Corps forces, or send in smaller vessels like medium amphibious ships into picking up and relocating those very same units to kind of do a shoot and scoot kind of construct to complicate Chinese targeting of them in those island chains. So commercial vision, but with military utility. So when it comes to the way we do business in the United States, it's easier to get Congress to support a military key operational problem. But as we do that in figuring out how to fight in the first island chain, should also be very aware about how that nurtures and builds out an American comparative advantage commercially at the same time.
How critical are alliances with nations like Japan, South Korea, Finland, and Canada to our naval strategy? And what steps should be taken to deepen these partnerships?
We are so far behind when it comes to shipbuilding and when it comes to the logistics and shipping that we can sustain ourselves in a major war, prolonged war, which will be measured in years, not weeks, with China. So we're going to need access to the shipping of our treaty allies like the Japanese, the Greeks, the Danes, etc. We're also going to need access to their shipbuilding. It may not be building great hulls and like destroyers and submarines, but we're going to need access to that, and we're going to need to do that driven by a commercial demand first. So this is where our allies come into play. It's beneficial for them to have a strong, vibrant, non-coercible United States, which right now is too overly reliant on Chinese shipping and Chinese shipbuilding for trade to be conducted. So the allies have a key role in that. They also have a key role, like in the Philippines and Japan, as frontline countries, as hosts to U.S. forces also. So we have to be smart about how we do that so that it's politically sustainable. And again, this is the framework of naval statecraft and developmental economics and trade facilitation, but with strategic also purpose in mind. You know, using the Navy, maritime forces, as the kind of the seed corn to prime the pump, also so to speak, to get this moving forward. So I think that's probably about the best way to put it.
Finally, as we explore the historical context, current challenges, and future strategies of U.S. naval power, what key message do you want our audience, veterans, the American public, to take away about the role in naval statecraft, ensuring America's security and global stability?
The first is to realize we are in dangerous times, and there are countries like China that have spent the last 20 years figuring out where our weaknesses are, building a world-class military with the sole purpose of defeating the United States. We need to take that serious. The risk is very high, and their confidence is growing, but it's not hopeless. We need to take action, and the naval statecraft is a framework for doing it that's focused in on the weaknesses of the Chinese and the Russians, but it also can draw them into decisive theaters where we can control the strategic initiative. And that's what we need to do if we're going to persevere and prevail in this new Cold War that we find ourselves in, not by our choice, but one that we're in nonetheless.
Great message. In your view, how can citizens, policymakers, and military professionals collaborate to rebuild and sustain the maritime strength necessary for confronting global rivalry?
Yeah, so first, everyone that's interested or concerned about our national defense should make that known to their elected members. Local, state, national, of course, but most importantly, the folks here in Capitol Hill where I work, to get that message to them, because the more voices, the more inescapable action will become. And that voice is important. Those that are in industry, if you're venture capital and you're looking at something new and unique, or you're working in something that maybe you're working on drones and you're thinking about more land bound, there might be some opportunities to start broadening it out into the maritime. And so taking a risk, this is probably the time to do it, to grow into the maritime. The global demand for shipping, as an aside fact, I haven't mentioned earlier, is going to outpace global production capacity. Even with the massive shipbuilding in China, we're going to go through a phase where the demand for new shipping is going to outstrip the ability to produce it. So it's an investment market. There's a reason why the South Koreans and the Japanese are looking at investing in the United States, Japan for steel, and the South Koreans in Philly shipyard.
How do cyber and space-based capabilities integrate in naval statecraft, and where do you see all vulnerabilities?
Communication, command and control of military units, but just being able to conduct commerce requires communications, be it under seabed cables, which the Russians and the Chinese are actively targeting and cutting and severing right now. Just earlier in the last 24 hours, the Taiwanese have had actually take over a Chinese tanker that did just that. Of course, we know there's also the stories of the last few months with Chinese ships in the Baltic Sea cutting cables between Finland and the Baltic states, and also with Sweden. So those cables are how we do commerce. It's also how we communicate. So that's also cyber. That's the digital kind of communication part. There's also the digital analytic part of this from the sensors. And this is where artificial intelligence and what you start to do and process with the data. So as we enter in the Internet of Things, where everything is interconnected, the speed and at which machines can analyze and learn, and then a human in that loop can then add some uncertainty for an adversary that's trying to counter us. The art in that, because it's more than a science, the art in that is going to be critical. But when it comes back to the kinetic and it comes back to the fight that we're in right now on this, there is cyber attacks on a daily basis, either to steal information or to break things. So we need to be more defensive, but we also have to also apply cost and go on the offense more often. It's always going to be behind the veil of secrecy. So there's much that we will never know. And then we have to be smarter about how we protect our undersea infrastructure, our cables and our pipelines. Because right now, the Chinese and the Russians have largely been able to do this without much cost.
Beyond its military actions, how does Russia use its Navy in unconventional ways, energy security, Arctic expansion, disinformation, to challenge U.S. interests?
I would take this up with both the Chinese and the Russians. For the Russians, I mean, they've suffered some very embarrassing defeats. The most recent was the loss of their bases in Syria, which even at the darkest days in the post-Cold War era for the Soviets and the Russians, they made sure to keep that base in Tartus, Syria, and then they were kicked out by, finally by the rebels that basically did away with the Assad regime. The other thing that they did is in the Black Sea, they were using their Kilo submarines to launch cruise missiles, and they still do that. There's nothing to sink them on the Ukraine side. But the Ukrainians, of course, very cleverly were able to sink the flagship of the Black Sea. So the Russians are somewhat challenged on the strategic communications and some of the influence ops through their Navy or their Maritime. But they still do some very troubling nuke tests and some other kind of cruise missile tests that they try to incite uncertainty on our side. So it's playing there. But the Chinese, they've been waging what's been called a maritime insurgency in the South China Sea, because the target is the people that operate and get their livelihoods off the ocean in Southeast Asia to bend to China's dictate, not the rules-based order that everyone is signed up to through multinational, through the UN, like the Law of the Sea Convention.
How important is the educational initiative, the 23 episodes that you and I talked about, the Americans for Stronger Navy delivering to the public? How important are these educational initiatives?
The more that people hear and that folks can kind of connect dots between their everyday life and how it relates or is connected to trade that is reliant on ships and the navies that act to protect that, the more that we can start to connect dots through your efforts like Stronger Navy is extremely important. Again, the more people that start to connect these dots and then insist that their political leadership take action, the better, because we are dangerously vulnerable if we continue on this path.
Good. Captain Sadler, thank you for all that you do for the U.S. Navy, our country at large. We certainly appreciate your efforts in Congress in Washington and the legislature, and certainly for your time today. Very well done. Thank you.
Thank you.